Alex turned the key on his rebuilt Bugatti Chiron, and the W16 engine fired on the first crank. 8 months of work had proven every single thing Bugatti said was impossible could actually be done, and yet that running engine solved exactly nothing when it comes to the real problem. Matt parked the car back in the garage because despite the successful first start and despite every custom bracket and modified exhaust component working exactly as intended, this 3 million-pound machine cannot leave that building. Running an engine and putting a vehicle on public roads are separated by a regulatory gap so wide that the entire mechanical achievement of the rebuild becomes almost irrelevant, and what sits between this Bugatti and legal road use reveals something about automotive manufacturing and right to repair that goes far beyond refusing to sell parts. The rebuild answered whether independent mechanics could physically reassemble a salvage supercar without factory support, and the answer was yes. What nobody considered during those 8 months of fabrication and problem solving was that modern vehicle certification creates dependencies that exist completely outside the mechanical realm, and Bugatti's leverage over this car didn't disappear when the engine started. The manufacturer still controls one critical piece of software that stands between this running Chiron and legal registration, which means the question of whether this car ever drives on public roads isn't about engineering anymore. Understanding why a functioning automobile cannot be driven requires looking at how salvage titles interact with roadworthiness certification in the United Kingdom, where Alex plans to register the vehicle. When the Chiron left the factory originally, it carried full type approval from the manufacturer, which certified that every safety system, emissions control, and structural component met European standards for road vehicles. The crash that totaled the car didn't erase that approval because the damage was purely physical, but when an insurance company declares a vehicle a salvage total loss, the legal situation changes completely. Salvage designation is a financial decision about repair costs versus vehicle value, but it triggers mandatory reinspection before the car can return to service, and for a Bugatti rebuilt without manufacturer involvement using custom components, that process becomes extraordinarily complex. The route for bringing this salvage Chiron back to legal status is the individual vehicle approval test, which the driver and vehicle licensing agency administers in the UK. IVA inspection isn't a driving test or a standard MOT check, and calling it thorough would be a massive understatement. Inspectors assess the vehicle against a comprehensive technical checklist covering brakes, steering systems, lighting assemblies, glazing, seatbelt mounting points, emissions output, noise levels, and structural integrity. For most rebuilt vehicles, the process is relatively straightforward because factory-correct repairs restore original specifications, and inspectors simply verify the work. But 3 specific areas on this Chiron will receive intense scrutiny that could prevent certification. The gearbox mounting bracket was repaired rather than replaced, and welding a safety-critical structural component creates questions that a simple visual inspection cannot answer. The inspector needs documentation of the repair process, evidence of proper welding procedures, and proof that the modified bracket meets the load-bearing requirements of the original specification. Matt documented everything on camera for YouTube, which means the videos themselves become the evidence pack. But whether video documentation satisfies an IVA inspector's requirements for structural repair verification is an open question. The exhaust system presents the second problem because the custom Valvetronic unit replacing the factory system must pass both emissions testing and noise level measurement. The secondary catalytic converters were removed during the rebuild while the primary cats remain, and whether that configuration meets current UK emission standards for a vehicle of this type and age is a specific technical question that cannot be answered until the car is on the testing equipment. Emissions regulations for luxury performance vehicles have specific limits, and aftermarket exhaust modifications frequently push cars outside those limits even when the engine runs cleanly. Structural integrity forms the third area of concern because the car was essentially cut in half and rejoined, which means inspectors will want to verify that every torque specification was followed, that replacement parts meet original equipment standards, and that the overall structural repair maintains the crashworthiness the vehicle had when new. The front and rear sections of a Bugatti Chiron are engineered to specific tolerances, and joining them back together requires precision that IVA inspectors will assess through measurements, component document verification and structural analysis. Before any of that inspection can even happen, another barrier exists that most people watching the rebuild never considered. UK law prohibits driving a vehicle to an IVA test without insurance coverage, and insuring a salvage-title Bugatti Chiron that has been independently rebuilt before it has any roadworthiness certification is not remotely straightforward. Standard motor insurance companies will not touch it because their underwriting risk models flag every single characteristic this car presents. The vehicle has no valid type approval, carries a salvage title, was rebuilt with custom components by independent mechanics without manufacturer involvement, and lacks any official certification of the repair quality. Specialist insurance exists through Lloyd's of London syndicates and modified vehicle insurers who understand salvage rebuilds, but the premium on a £3 million salvage supercar will be staggering. What's more important than cost is that underwriters will demand answers about the repair process, the components used, the qualifications of the people who did the work, and the testing that verified the rebuild. This is where Matt's obsessive documentation for YouTube becomes critical for a second purpose, because everything filmed for entertainment value now serves as the evidence pack for insurance underwriting. The rebuild documented for viewers is simultaneously the proof an insurance company needs to assess whether covering this vehicle represents acceptable risk. None of those hurdles are insurmountable, and none of them represent Bugatti actively blocking the car from the road. Every challenge described so far can be solved with time, money, documentation, and patience. But there is one obstacle that Bugatti still controls absolutely, and it exists in software rather than mechanical systems. The body control module stored the crash event data when the accident occurred, and that BCM is currently in a post-crash state that restricts certain vehicle functions. The car starts and runs, but fault codes remain active, and multiple systems operate in degraded mode rather than full functionality. For IVA inspection purposes, a vehicle presenting with active fault codes and systems not operating correctly will fail immediately because inspectors need to see everything functioning as the manufacturer designed. Clearing those fault codes requires a BCM reset, and performing a BCM reset on a Bugatti Chiron requires the manufacturer's proprietary diagnostic system. The software exists only on computers inside Bugatti's authorized service network, which means Matt cannot do this independently no matter how capable he is as a mechanic. No aftermarket diagnostic tool can perform the specific reset this BCM needs, and Bugatti has refused to support the rebuild at every stage, which means they have given no indication they will assist now. This is the leverage Bugatti retains even though the car runs and the rebuild is mechanically complete. Someone needs to connect a Bugatti diagnostic computer to this vehicle and clear the post-crash fault codes before IVA inspection becomes possible, and that someone must either work for Bugatti or have access to an authorized dealer. Whether that cooperation happens quietly through a dealer who performs the reset without official company endorsement, or whether it gets refused entirely, keeping the car permanently garage-bound despite being fully functional, is the last question this entire rebuild must answer. What the road legal process reveals goes beyond this specific Bugatti. The rebuild proved that independent mechanics with skill and determination can physically reassemble a salvage supercar, and every mechanical argument Bugatti made about impossibility has been directly answered by a running W16 engine. But achieving physical capability is not the same as overcoming the regulatory frameworks that embed manufacturer dependency into modern vehicles. IVA emissions testing depends on factory specifications. Insurance underwriting requires documented repair standards that independent rebuilds struggle to provide, and BCM resets require proprietary software that only manufacturers control. These are not the same as refusing to sell replacement parts, and they represent structural features of the automotive regulatory environment that create manufacturer involvement at points the manufacturer doesn't have to actively manage. Bugatti doesn't need to refuse anything at this stage because they simply need to not cooperate, and the legal and insurance processes do the rest of the work. This represents the next frontier of right-to-repair advocacy. The conversation has focused on parts availability and technical documentation, but regulatory frameworks that require manufacturer involvement to put repaired vehicles back into service create dependencies that exist outside those battles. The rebuild answered the mechanical question about whether independent shops can fix complex modern cars, and the answer is clearly yes. The road legal process is now asking the regulatory question about whether those repairs can actually result in vehicles that return to public roads, and that answer depends on systems that independent mechanics cannot control. The Bugatti starts, the W16 runs properly, and the rebuild is complete in every physical sense, and the car cannot leave the garage. IVA testing must be scheduled, insurance must be arranged, the BCM reset must be performed, emissions must be verified, and structural repairs must be documented for inspection. Every single one of those steps is achievable, and none of them are actually impossible, but every one of them requires navigating processes that the salvage title, the manufacturer's silence, and the modified components make significantly more complicated than standard vehicle repair. Whether Bugatti provides the cooperation needed for that final BCM reset is the question this rebuild cannot answer through mechanical skill alone, and the moment this car leaves the garage for the first time will prove more than just whether the engine works. That first drive will be the final proof that right to repair can overcome not just technical barriers but regulatory ones as well.